My guest today says the world has an expiration date, and we're going to ultimately ask if you're ready for that date. My guest, Amir Tsarfati, also says that we are frankly in the most exciting times, the most interesting times since the days of Jesus Christ on earth. Amir is one of my speakers at Understanding the Times 2017, Saturday, October the 7th. He's founder of Behold Israel. He is a native-born Israeli, an officer in the IDF, and a Bible teacher around the globe. He has a large footprint in the electronic media. We'll say more about that. He's on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, his website, beholdisrael.org. He also leads tours in Israel where you will get the biblical and eschatological angle like no other. Amir Tsarfati, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Jan. It's an honor.
Where to start? I think I'd like to just briefly revisit your message you gave at Understanding the Times 2016, and it was titled Europe, Preparing for the Antichrist. Let me just give a couple of bullet points, and then I'm going to ask a question of you. But in that message, you trace some of the occultic roots that go back, quite frankly, to the Tower of Babel or Babel. The tower was an attempt to prove there was no God or else to replace God. And over the years, Brussels, Belgium, has sort of become the headquarters of all that they tried to do at Babel, occupying a building similar to the Tower of Babel, and near it a woman riding the beast. And then you trace the occult roots that Europe has from, you included, and I'm skipping a lot because you had an hour-long message. You talked about the Freemasons, you talked about the Illuminati, you talked about all of them and more, sort of worshiping Satan, coming against God. You talked about CERN, even about the dedication of the Gotthard Base Tunnel, June 1st of 2016. Explain why you emphasized the dark side of Europe.
I'm not sure the Europeans see that as dark side. For them, it's obviously not, but for us, the believers, we must be very careful because Satan always appears as an angel of light, and for them, these are all noble things. I mean, going all the way back, even, I believe, to the Tower of Babel, those people didn't think they're doing anything wrong. In Europe itself, we see how there was an attempt no longer to go to physical Babylon, but as you remember in my message, is to import Babylon into the continent of Europe. This is why it's a mystery Babylon, because it's not the traditional location, it's the spirit of Babylon with the mindset of Babylon that was literally, physically, and spiritually imported into Europe. And with that, of course, the satanic worship, the Luciferian worship, the occult, and Europe has been doing that for so long. And unfortunately, the American establishment, whether it's the business one, whether it's the religious one, whether it's the educational one, has been or had been tremendously affected by that which came out of Europe. Every time American scholars would go to Europe, they'll come back with all that, garbage and spread it out. So Europe has not only been importing it, but exporting it to the rest of the world. Yeah. And that's a point of concern, as you know.
Well, it was a fascinating message, one of the more fascinating I've heard. And, of course, I've been doing conferences. I think we're on our 21st or 22nd. But that message was extremely unique. And then the pictures that you had to go along. Folks, you can get a set of DVDs of that event back October 2016. We're kind of leading up, just where is Europe going with all of the kind of satanic involvement that it keeps inviting. Amir, Europe, I think, is ready for someone to rise and solve its many problems. And, like you pointed out in this particular message, they've added a new ingredient, and that is this massive immigration, which it's not only destabilized Europe, this immigration, it's on the verge of destroying Europe. It's certainly not what it was 50, 60 years ago with all the immigration. And it's turned very anti-Israel. And again, it's focusing on such paganistic things. But then you and I have both been watching a young man, and he is young, he's not even 40, Emmanuel Macron, and you and I have been writing about him, and when he turns up on the cover of the Economist magazine, it's a picture of him literally walking on water, and the caption underneath it is asking if he's the savior of Europe. My goodness, we had to pay attention to this.
Yeah, very much so. I think the New York Times already detected that probably earlier, weeks before, talking about this is the guy who will revive Europe. And I'm always reminded of what I taught about the revival of the Roman Empire. And so speaking with the language of the guy will revive Europe, and then the guy will be the savior of Europe. But let's not forget, Emmanuel Macron has assumed upon himself a position that is beyond Europe. I mean, if you remember, a few days after his election, for the first time in the history of presidents elected in France, the guy goes on camera, speaks perfect English to the rest of the world, and basically talks about the move of Donald Trump, President Trump, to pull out of the Paris Agreement. And he basically said, although I respect the president's decision, I am actually calling, I think it's a mistake, and I call everyone that are on board with us for the climate change to actually come over to France and to Europe, and we will gladly take care of you, because we need to make our planet great again.
Right.
It's beyond Europe now. I mean, the guy is now assuming upon himself the leader of the climate change effort on behalf of the whole universe.
Right. I noticed this, and he spoke in English, which he rarely does. This is just a very, very interesting character. There are some other things that we need to bring into the discussion. First of all, I want to clarify why we're even focusing on Europe right now. And folks, you're listening to Understanding the Times Radio. I'm Jan Markell. I have on the line from Mexico, because he's been having meetings in Mexico. He's on his way out today, I believe. Amir Sarfati, one of my speakers, coming up October the 7th. But Amir, you and I are referring to the book of Daniel, particularly Daniel 9, and particularly Daniel 9:27, which speaks of Daniel's 70th week, the time of Jacob's trouble. And we believe, anyway, because it's the city that destroyed Jerusalem in 70 A.D., that would have been Europe, probably from the region of Rome, that the European Antichrist is going to come along, double-cross Israel, go into the temple halfway through the tribulation, and declare himself God. That's why we are interested in Europe. I know other theologies have come along in more recent years that would they'd want to debate us, but let's just look a little bit more at Emmanuel Macron. He's a globalist. He had globalist backing. He's even stated the French culture does not exist, and yet he had a resounding victory saying the French culture, I guess a globalist would say the French culture doesn't exist.
It's amazing how we have to draw a direct line, and it has to be very clearly indicated, to the first savior in the last 10 years, Obama, that was sent by the one world government elite to spread the Arab Spring, and basically I would call it a two-stage effect. The first one was, of course, the most devastating time the Arab world has known in decades, with over 500,000 casualties and millions of displaced people, and that, of course, pressed Europe, and Europe, under so much pressure, started seeing the rise of the far right wing, and Europe, with its guilt trip and guilt feelings of what happened there in the 1930s and 40s, was so panicky that it was willing to choose someone they don't even know, as long as we don't get someone who reminds us of our past.
Yep.
And so that was one process. And the second, not in time-wise, but probably simultaneously, is, of course, that which happened in Syria that brought Russia and Turkey and Iran to our border and caused Netanyahu to start looking for allies in Africa, and basically left only Sudan and Libya outside of the African game. And by doing so, we have the 5 countries that Ezekiel is describing already ganging up around Israel and waiting for the right moment to do something. So we see that what Obama did, I'm not sure he's that smart. I think that it wasn't, he didn't know it's going to happen, but I think the people behind him who pulled the strings were hoping it's going to happen. He basically prepared the Middle East and prepared Europe. And everybody, all the time, always speaking about what's going on in the Middle East. It's a good thing for us to also see what's going on in Europe and understand how Europe is getting ready for the Antichrist. Now, remember, Jan, my message started actually in Daniel 2. We talked about Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream.
Yes.
So we can understand what is that last empire of the feet and, with the clay and iron, and how Jesus is the one who will destroy it. So obviously the return of Jesus will destroy an empire. And we see how it started there. And then, of course, we went to the 7th chapter of Daniel to see Daniel's vision of the beast with the 10 horns and how the 3 are plucked out and 1 comes out there. And that is, of course, speaking pompous words. And then we move to, obviously, chapter 9 to the 70th week.
Right.
So there's a process here that we see that happens. Simultaneously, we see both the Middle East geared up and Europe geared up for 2 major events that are going to happen, which I'm not sure if we're even going to see them.